In the opulent halls of Tudor England, where tapestries concealed listening ears and a single whispered word could mean the difference between elevation and execution, one woman possessed such magnetic power that she drove the most feared king in Christendom to shatter 1,000 years of religious tradition, defy the Pope himself, and ultimately destroy anyone who stood between him and his obsession. Anne Boleyn, with her raven-black hair and eyes that burned like midnight stars, wielded a dangerous combination of intelligence, ambition, and sexual allure that would topple queens, remake nations, and prove that love, or perhaps lust, could indeed conquer all, even if it demanded rivers of blood in payment. Ready to discover the shocking truth about the woman who seduced a king into madness? Like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe with the notification bell on to uncover the scandalous secrets of Anne Boleyn, the temptress whose love affair literally changed the world and cost thousands their lives. Born sometime between 1501 and 1507 in the countryside of Norfolk, Anne entered a world where women were valued primarily as vessels for producing male heirs and maintaining family alliances. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, possessed the cunning and ruthless ambition that would later manifest so brilliantly in his daughter, while her mother, Elizabeth Howard, brought the blood of England's most powerful noble families coursing through Anne's veins, blood that would prove both her making and her undoing. The Boleyn family's rise from merchant origins to court prominence required a careful navigation of Tudor politics that would serve as Anne's earliest education in the deadly art of influence. Thomas Boleyn understood that in Henry VIII's England, proximity to power was everything, and he positioned his children like chess pieces in a game where the stakes were measured in lands, titles, and ultimately lives themselves. Anne's formative years were spent not in England, but in the sophisticated courts of Europe, first in the Netherlands under the tutelage of Margaret of Austria, then in the glittering palace of Francis I of France. These experiences, extraordinary for any woman of her era, equipped her with languages, accomplishments, and most dangerously of all, a continental understanding of how intelligent women could wield influence over powerful men through wit rather than mere submission. The French court where she spent her adolescence was a hothouse of sexual intrigue and intellectual sophistication, where royal mistresses like Françoise de Foix demonstrated that a clever woman could accumulate genuine political power by managing her relationships with strategic precision. Anne absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a spy learning tradecraft, understanding that knowledge was power and that power, properly wielded, could transform even the humblest origins into royal destiny. When she returned to England in 1522, Anne Boleyn had been transformed from a provincial English girl into a cosmopolitan woman whose very presence suggested secrets and sophistications that the insular Tudor court had never experienced. Her dark eyes, which contemporary observers described as possessing an almost hypnotic intensity, seemed to promise mysteries that lesser mortals could never fully comprehend, while her wit could reduce the most learned courtiers to stammering adolescents. Her initial appointment as maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon placed her in the perfect position to observe the growing tensions in the royal marriage. Catherine, once the radiant Spanish princess whose union with Henry had sealed an international alliance, had aged into a pious but increasingly desperate woman whose failure to produce a surviving male heir haunted every moment of her existence. Anne watched with calculating eyes as the king's frustration grew, and his attention began wandering toward younger, more fertile possibilities. The first phase of Anne's conquest was conducted with a subtlety that would have impressed the most experienced courtesan. Rather than throwing herself at the king like the parade of eager noblewomen who had previously caught his fancy, she employed a strategy of strategic withdrawal that transformed pursuit into obsession. When Henry's initial advances met with polite but firm rejection, his interest transformed from casual lust into something approaching madness. Her mastery of the courtly love tradition, learned in France, allowed her to reframe Henry's desire within a romantic framework that elevated their relationship from mere sexual pursuit to something approaching spiritual quest. She presented herself not as a potential mistress, but as a lady whose virtue could only be claimed by one worthy of ultimate commitment, namely, marriage itself. This gambit was so audacious that it literally redefined the rules of royal courtship. The love letters that Henry penned to Anne during their courtship reveal a monarch reduced to the status of supplicant, begging for favors from a woman who possessed no titles, armies, or treasuries with which to command respect. 17 of these letters survive today, each one a testament to Anne's complete psychological domination over the most powerful man in England. In them, Henry pleads, cajoles, and promises with the desperation of a man possessed by forces beyond his comprehension or control. But Anne's greatest stroke of genius lay in recognizing that Henry's desire for her was inseparable from his need for a legitimate male heir. By positioning herself not merely as an object of lust, but as the solution to the succession crisis that threatened the Tudor dynasty, she transformed personal attraction into a matter of national security. Her promise of sons became the key that would unlock not just the king's heart, but the entire English Reformation. The king's great matter, Henry's pursuit of annulment from Catherine of Aragon, began as a personal obsession but evolved into a constitutional crisis that would reshape English society forever. Anne's influence over this process was both subtle and decisive, as she provided Henry with the emotional support and intellectual justification necessary to maintain his resolve against mounting opposition from Rome, Spain, and his own advisors. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister and the architect of English foreign policy for nearly 2 decades, became the first casualty of Anne's rise to power. Wolsey's failure to secure the annulment from Pope Clement VII sealed his doom, but it was Anne's relentless campaign against him that ensured his complete destruction. She understood that Wolsey represented the old order of papal authority and international diplomacy that stood between her and the throne, and she orchestrated his downfall with a precision that would have impressed Borgia princes. The appointment of Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury marked Anne's most brilliant strategic victory, demonstrating her understanding that religious revolution required religious leadership willing to embrace radical change. Cranmer, whose Protestant sympathies had been carefully concealed during his rise through ecclesiastical ranks, became the instrument through which Anne's marriage to Henry could be legitimized and Catherine's claim to queenship definitively destroyed. The secret wedding ceremony that took place on November 14, 1532, represented the culmination of Anne's 6-year campaign to become queen, but it also marked the beginning of her most dangerous period. Pregnant with the child who would become Elizabeth I, she had finally achieved her ultimate goal, but success brought with it enemies whose hatred had been festering for years, and who now possessed the motivation to destroy her completely. Her coronation on June 1, 1533, was staged as a spectacular display of royal magnificence designed to overawe opponents and demonstrate the irreversible nature of the religious and political changes she had initiated. Yet beneath the pageantry lay a cold calculation of power relationships, as Anne used the ceremony to reward allies, intimidate enemies, and establish the new religious order that would govern English spiritual life for centuries. The birth of Elizabeth, rather than the expected son, represented Anne's first serious miscalculation, though she could hardly have anticipated the gender of her child. Henry's disappointment was palpable and dangerous, as it called into question the divine approval that he had claimed for his revolutionary break with Rome. Anne's promise of sons had justified the destruction of England's ancient religious traditions, and her failure to deliver immediately undermined her position in ways that no amount of charm or intelligence could remedy. Her second pregnancy, which ended in miscarriage, intensified the pressure surrounding her fertility and gave her enemies their first real opportunity to suggest that God's favor might not rest upon the new religious settlement after all. The whispers that began circulating through court suggested that Anne's inability to produce male heirs indicated divine displeasure with Henry's actions, creating a theological crisis that threatened everything she had accomplished. The emergence of Jane Seymour as Henry's new obsession demonstrated how quickly royal favor could shift and how precarious Anne's position had always been. Jane's apparent virtue and her family's careful positioning as representatives of traditional English values provided Henry with both an alternative to Anne and a justification for abandoning the woman whose love had once driven him to remake his entire kingdom. Thomas Cromwell's decision to abandon his former ally and orchestrate Anne's destruction revealed the ruthless pragmatism that characterized Tudor politics at its most lethal. Cromwell understood that his own survival depended on maintaining royal favor, and when that favor shifted away from Anne, he proved perfectly willing to destroy the woman whose rise he had initially supported. His fabrication of evidence against her demonstrated both his legal cunning and his complete lack of moral scruples. The charges of adultery, incest, and treason that were brought against Anne in 1536 were so obviously manufactured that even contemporary observers recognized them as political theater, designed to provide legal justification for a predetermined outcome. Yet the very audacity of these accusations revealed Henry's determination to rid himself of the woman who had once represented his deepest desires, but who now symbolized his frustrated hopes for male heirs. The men accused alongside Anne, including her own brother George, were selected not for their guilt, but for their vulnerability and their symbolic importance in Anne's network of relationships. By implicating her brother in charges of incest, Cromwell created a narrative so shocking that it justified the complete destruction of the Boleyn family's influence while simultaneously explaining Anne's failure to produce the sons that Henry so desperately needed. Mark Smeaton, the court musician whose confession under torture provided the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, represented the most tragic figure in this judicial charade. His humble origins made him the perfect scapegoat, as his testimony could be extracted through methods that would never have been employed against noblemen, while his alleged relationship with Anne provided the sexual details that transformed political necessity into a compelling story of royal betrayal. The trial itself was a masterpiece of legal manipulation, conducted before judges who understood that their own survival depended on delivering the verdict that Henry desired. Anne's defense, brilliant though it was, could never overcome the predetermined nature of the proceedings, though her courage and intelligence during these final days created a legend that would outlive her executioner. Her final speech from the scaffold demonstrated the same combination of intelligence and dignity that had characterized her rise to power, though it was carefully crafted to protect her daughter's future while maintaining her own innocence. The woman who had once made a king defy Rome and destroy ancient traditions faced her own destruction with a composure that impressed even her enemies and created a martyrdom that would inspire Protestant propagandists for generations. The French executioner specially imported for her execution represented Henry's final tribute to the woman whose continental sophistication had first attracted his attention. The swift stroke of the sword, rather than the brutal hacking of an axe, provided a death that was both merciful and symbolic, a recognition that Anne Boleyn had been no ordinary victim, but a queen whose destruction required extraordinary measures. Her daughter Elizabeth's eventual accession to the throne vindicated Anne's sacrifice in ways that neither she nor Henry could have anticipated. The brilliant, powerful queen, who would define English greatness for an entire age, carried within her the intelligence, determination, and political acuity that had characterized her mother's brief but transformative reign. Anne's blood had produced the male heir that eluded her, but in the form of a woman whose capabilities exceeded those of any king. The religious revolution that Anne had inspired continued to shape English society long after her death, creating a Protestant identity that would influence English culture, politics, and international relations for centuries. Her role in breaking Rome's authority over England made possible the flowering of English literature, science, and commerce that would characterize the Elizabethan age and beyond. The legends that grew around Anne's memory reflected the complex emotions she had inspired during her lifetime, equal parts admiration and revulsion, fascination and fear. Catholic propaganda portrayed her as a witch whose supernatural powers had corrupted a previously pious king, while Protestant historians celebrated her as a martyr whose sacrifice had freed England from papal tyranny and foreign domination. Modern scholarship has gradually penetrated the layers of myth and propaganda that surrounded Anne's story, revealing a woman whose political intelligence and strategic thinking exceeded those of most male courtiers of her era. Her ability to maintain Henry's obsession for 6 years while navigating the dangerous waters of Tudor court politics demonstrated skills that would have challenged the most experienced diplomats and statesmen. Her influence on English queenship established precedents that would govern royal marriages for centuries, as future queens learned both from her successes and her failures. The expectation that royal wives would be more than mere breeding stock, that they would contribute intellectually and culturally to their kingdoms, owed much to Anne's brief but transformative reign. The cultural impact of her story extends far beyond the political and religious changes she initiated, as the narrative of the woman who made a king destroy his kingdom for love has inspired countless artistic interpretations and literary works. Each generation has reimagined Anne according to its own preoccupations, making her a mirror for changing attitudes toward female ambition, sexual agency, and the relationship between personal desire and political responsibility. Her correspondence and the contemporary accounts of her behavior reveal a woman who understood that intelligence and education were her most potent weapons in a world that offered women few avenues to legitimate power. Her facility with languages, her knowledge of theology and law, and her grasp of international politics equipped her to function as Henry's intellectual equal rather than merely his sexual partner. The speed with which Henry moved from obsessive love to murderous hatred illuminated the dangerous psychology of absolute power and the precarious position of anyone who depended entirely on royal favor for survival. Anne's fate demonstrated that even the most brilliant manipulation of a monarch's emotions could not provide permanent security in a system where the king's will was literally law. Today, as we grapple with questions about the nature of power, the role of women in leadership, and the relationship between personal relationships and political outcomes, Anne Boleyn's story remains powerfully relevant. She proved that exceptional individuals could reshape history through force of personality and strategic thinking. But her destruction also illustrated the ultimate vulnerability of those who challenge established systems without building independent sources of power. Her legacy reminds us that historical change often requires individuals willing to risk everything for the possibility of transformation, and that the most profound revolutions sometimes begin in bedchambers and drawing rooms rather than on battlefields or in legislative assemblies. Anne Boleyn made a king kill for love, but in doing so, she also made him create a new world whose consequences extended far beyond anything either of them could have imagined. In the end, Anne Boleyn achieved a form of immortality that eluded most monarchs, becoming not just a historical figure, but an eternal symbol of the transformative power of human desire. Her story proves that love, whether real or calculated, can indeed move mountains, topple governments, and reshape civilizations, though it may demand the ultimate price from those brave or foolish enough to wield such dangerous magic.